Welcome again to the first of our Psychology and Economics of Poverty PEP seminar series. I'm Christina Halez, the program manager for SIGA's PEP initiative. The initiative, as some of you know, brings together psychologists and economists to explore how poverty affects cognition, beliefs, and decision-making, and then the consequent implications for health, early childhood development, economic outcomes, among others. So we work with a really lovely growing community of faculty and graduate students across disciplines. And we do things like hosting monthly lab meetings with that community, competitive funding opportunities, and an annual convening to sort of explore new research and methods. PEP is co-directed by UC Berkeley faculty members Mahesh Srinivasan an associate professor in psychology, and Supreet Kaur, who is an assistant professor in economics. And Supreet will be moderating this seminar for us today. And just to give you a little background on our speaker, we have today Kate Orkin with us, who is sharing the results from an intervention involving cash transfers and aspirational videos in Western Kenya. And Kate is a senior research fellow in behavioral economics, and she leads the Mind and Behavior Research Group in the Center for the Study of African Economies, which is hosted at the Blavatnik School at the University of Oxford. So her work, she does a lot of work kind of examining the effect of integrating psychological interventions into asset transfer type programs, and also works very closely with psychologists to look at the effects of treating mental health disorders on economic behavior and outcomes. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate right now, but what we're going to be doing throughout the seminar is pausing every so often to take questions at natural breaks. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function in the reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can type it into the chat, and Supreet will be helping us moderate these questions. So everyone will be muted unless we ask you to unmute yourself to ask your questions. So that's how we're going to be taking care of questions for the seminar. And just so everyone knows, we are recording for posting later. So if you need any technical help, please chat me or Dustin Marshall using the chat function, and I will let Kate now take it away for us.
Actually, before Kate starts, just one housekeeping thing. I think if you have a clarifying question, just put it in the chat, because I'll interrupt Kate if I feel like you know there's something that she should answer right away. So please feel free to ask clarifying questions or just questions in general. And if you put them into the chat, I'll see them immediately and I can stop Kate immediately. And then we're going to leave 10 minutes at the end for general discussion. Okay. All right, take it away, Kate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And this is going to be the best seminar ever, because it's got the highest concentration of previous research assistants that I've seen from across the globe. So thanks very much to all of you who've joined, some of you who will be able to see results that have taken longer than you would have thought possible from the time when you finished the fieldwork. But thank you very much for joining us. So you'll see this is joint work with a large team of co-authors. Thanks also to partners, Give Directly, IPA, and Kangaroo Media. And as I said, a great team of research assistants. So as anyone in this initiative would know, there's been growing attention paid by both policymakers and academics to how decision-making functions in context of poverty. So theorists in economics have now accumulated quite a body of work on how particular psychological characteristics may affect decisions of a certain sort. So we're going to call these future-oriented behavior. And by this, I mean people's decisions to exert effort, to save, to invest in particular kinds of economic activity. These are obviously distinct, but we think that there's a commonality, that they involve trading off, incurring current costs in order to potentially have benefits in future. So economists have wondered whether, or have posited in theory, suggesting that certain psychological characteristics, low aspirations, present bias, depression, might lead to people to have lower levels of future-oriented behavior than they might have had with different levels of these characteristics, and that difference in behavior might lead them to have lower wealth. In addition, people have suggested that those characteristics, so for example, low aspirations, may be caused or may be worsened by the very difficult nature of a life lived in poverty. Increasingly, we've seen experimental evidence as well from economics, mainly in developing countries, but also from social psychology and other parts of psychology on various links in this causal chain. So often inducing exogenous variation in one of these psychological barriers, and then studying what happens to people's behavior and sometimes to end outcomes. This has been done with interventions with children, but also some with adults. And then many people, including many of you on this call, have looked at this relationship between living in various levels of poverty and psychological barriers. So there's quite a long causal chain here. And this evidence, both that poverty causes psychological barriers and that psychological barriers might affect behavior, raises quite a big question for poverty reduction interventions. And that question is, are these psychological barriers to future-oriented investment something that persist with a change in wealth, or do these go away when people's circumstances improve? Are these something that somebody who has had an experience of living in poverty will always carry with them, that will always affect their decision-making? Or are these barriers just a result of being poor currently? And if that circumstance changes, the psychology, the psychology of living in poverty no longer applies. This is important for policy because, as many of us know, there's been a lot of debate between more bundled programs, which are known, in many instances to be very highly effective programs that not only target people's asset wealth, but try to lift them out of poverty through various behavioral and mentorship interventions. Those programs are known to be very effective, but on the other hand, they're quite expensive. And so on the other, we've seen a lot of advocates who said, let's just keep it as simple as we can, go for direct cash transfers and just target poverty. And so this question is important for that sort of policy debate. It also raises important theory questions. So, are these particular psychological characteristics and wealth complements or substitutes in an individual's production function? And some individuals have raised the question of, well, if they're complements, then we might end up with a situation of psychological poverty traps. So it may be the case that even if we manage to get people out of poverty, they're going to continue to make decisions as though they were still poor, and that might constrain them from investments that might make sure that they stayed out of poverty in the long term. So there's a big sort of set of debates around this question and to which this question is relevant. So we're going to try and address that in this paper. This is reporting the initial results, and this is the first time I've presented it. So, it will be great to get your feedback. We're going to use a randomized control trial at village level with 8,200 women in 415 villages in Western Kenya. The first arm is going to be allocating these women to receive a video intervention and a goal setting exercise, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. The second set of villages, people get a placebo intervention. So it's also a video, it's also an exercise, but it doesn't have any psychological content. And then in the third and fourth arms, we're going to be, it's also got the placebo and the psychologically active video structure, but we basically have a cash transfer on top. So arm 3 just get the cash transfer and the placebo, and then arm 4 get a combination of interventions, one of which is the cash transfer and the other of which is this psychologically active intervention. And then after the interventions, we're going to measure people's aspirations, behavior, and then a range of psychological mechanisms. And the median follow-up time is about 19 months, so sort of close to 2 years. So we're going to proceed in 2 steps. The first is to test for the relationship between aspirations and this sort of bundle of investment behaviors we call future-oriented investment. So we had an intervention that we'd done, some of you will have seen earlier work we did in Ethiopia with a similar intervention that targeted and raised people's aspirations and these behaviors over a 5-year period. So we're going to develop a similar intervention for the Kenyan setting, going to give it to people in arm 1 and then compare people's aspirations and behavior in arms 1 and 2 to see if a higher level of aspirations induced by the video increases future-oriented investment. And then the second stage of the argument is to test whether aspirations remain a barrier to future-oriented investment when people's wealth has increased. So among those who got the cash transfer, this cash transfer is big. It's bigger than, so Kenyan per capita income is $1,400 PPP. So this household is getting almost as much as an average Kenyan would earn in a year. So there's been a big increase in wealth for this household. Does the relationship between aspirations and future-oriented investment for those now wealthier individuals remain the same? And the way that we look at that is we say, well, there was this video that induced an increase in aspirations and altered future-oriented behavior when people were poor. Does that have the same effect on aspirations and behavior when they have received a cash transfer compared to a group who get cash alone? So that's the sort of two steps that we're going to proceed in.
Kate, there's a clarifying question from Bilal.
Hi, Kate. Just wanted to confirm that this is a one-off cash transfer made at the point of these other interventions, and therefore is kind of seen as presumably seen as very much a part of this treatment, or is this a kind of a series of smaller lump sum transfers over time?
So it's one cash transfer. It's you get a small token of about $200, and then you get two large lump sum payments. They're only a couple of months apart, and you receive the intervention as one bundled intervention. So Give Directly does a census, and then they identify you as eligible, and then you're told you're getting this intervention. So you can it's definitely not like receiving a longer term stream of income. The other part of the question was, do people see the people who did the psychological intervention and the cash transfer as the same people? So we did try and draw a distinction. IPA did the psychological intervention, but in practice, people may often have thought that the people who did the video intervention were linked to the people who did the cash transfer. It's a little bit difficult to distinguish that. But I think what is important is it's made very clear that the cash transfer is completely unconditional. There's no expectations that people undertake any kind of behavior. So, it's possible that they may have thought that the video intervention was, encouraging particular kinds of behaviors. That's one of the things that we will test. But it definitely, there was no link drawn between do what's said in this video and getting the cash transfer. So, Supreet, were there any other immediate ones?
No.
So the main results, so in the first step, we find that in this sample of poor women, aspirations and investment are indeed causally related. So the psychological intervention increases aspirations for the future, mainly through increasing children's education, but also people's economic aspirations. We see effects of this intervention, so it increases input use, labor supply, people's revenue, and then their end outcomes in terms of their savings, which is a bit more like a behavior, and their end asset wealth. We're going to show that that doesn't occur through a range of other mechanisms that we measured. So people's beliefs about their returns to their own effort or these particular activities, their preferences, or some psychological characteristics. And the intervention was also targeted at aspirations. It's certainly unlikely that it activated any economic channels of any kind. Just watching a video and doing a goal setting exercise is very unlikely to have done anything else economic. So for all of those reasons, we're going to argue it looks as though this is going through a mechanism of aspirations. Then the second part of the argument is to understand how does that relationship change when people become much wealthier? And we see that in some domains, this so-called aspirations barrier to investment persists even after a wealth shock. But in other domains, it disappears. So it really depends on the type of aspiration and the type of behavior that one is talking about. So when it comes to economic aspirations, so those are, what income or wealth would you like to have in the future? And then people's economic behavior, what they invest in, how hard they work. we see no additional effect of the psychological intervention once people have received the cash transfer. And that's partly because the cash transfer has a very large impact on people's economic aspirations in and of itself. So, in that domain of behavior, it seems like once you've become wealthier, you leave the aspirations barrier behind. On the other hand, even with this huge wealth shock, education aspirations and investment don't increase. And in fact, an additional boost to aspirations is needed. We see quite clearly this sort of mechanism argument here. So cash doesn't increase education aspirations, but the combined intervention does. And the combined group end up spending significantly more on education than the cash group do. We can't disentangle exactly what it is about education that means that that's a different domain. It may be that it is because it's an intergenerational investment. It may also be because it's riskier and much longer term, or because there's some sort of social status attached to moving into a much higher level of education that people don't feel that they can aspire to. We aren't sure, but it certainly seems like the effects are quite domain specific. So in terms of the contribution to the literature, as I said in the beginning, there's been these extensive literatures on the effect of altering psychological characteristics on economic outcomes, and then the effect in the opposite direction. What we're going to do with this design is, a lot of the papers that have looked at the effect of altering psychological characteristics have found heterogeneous treatment effects by wealth. So they find that the interventions are less effective for people who are wealthier, which suggests that it may be poverty that is causing some of these psychological constraints. But they can't show that, because when you're looking at baseline heterogeneity, you aren't sure what causes that. Is it wealth, or is it something else about those people that both leads to them being wealthy and to the psychological characteristic? So we're able to provide causal evidence on how aspirations affects investment at different wealth levels. Some other people have also used this design, but that has been combining cash with CBT type interventions that target other psychological constraints. So, for example, depression or addiction. So we're using a similar design, but to study a different psychological constraint. And then, of course, as I alluded to at the beginning, there's a huge policy discussion about how we best design asset transfers to reduce poverty, and we're going to contribute to that. So just to give you a sense of where we are. So this is the Indian Ocean. This is Lake Victoria. We're going to be in Western Kenya. So this is a much poorer part of the country than the rest of Kenya, and it's why Give Directly's interventions are targeted there. So we do a census before villagers know anything about Give Directly. So they don't know that they're being targeted for the cash transfer program. They haven't heard of Give Directly. We do a census. We survey households using Give Directly's poverty census, and we're going to use that census across treatment and control villages to sample between 9 and 20 households in each village who meet Give Directly's poverty criteria. So we know who would have been eligible for the cash transfer even in the control villages. In those households, we then survey the primary woman, and we ask about household economic outcomes, but also a lot about her psychological characteristics, as we call them. So her aspirations and expectations for the future, her self-efficacy, so her beliefs about her ability to effect change, her preferences, and we do that at baseline and then 19 months after the first cash transfers. So this is just some correlations just to kind of set the scene. So this is the eligible households broken down by their consumption per adult equivalent in the household at baseline, so a common kind of poverty measure. So these would be the poorest households within our already poor sample, and these are the slightly wealthier ones. You can see these households are really living at just over $1.50 a day. But then, and our measures are all making sense. So people who are poorer have fewer assets, they spend less on inputs, they earn less than people who are slightly wealthier. The important things to point out here, there is a gradient between, in wealth and education expenditure. So it definitely seems that wealthier households are able to spend more on education. But quite interestingly, there isn't a wealth gradient in aspirations for children's education. So within this poor sample of women, even the women who are slightly wealthier haven't yet got higher aspirations for their kids' education. We do see, however, that as you get wealthier within the sample, you get higher aspirations for assets and income.
Kate, another question from Bilal.
Hi, sorry, this is the other Bilal. You're getting the Bilal treatment. Quick question, how are you differentiating between aspirations and expectations? I mean, it seems like when you're measuring them in survey questions, they're going to be very related. Is it the time horizon that's different, or is there something else you're doing?
So we asked about them over the same time horizon, so in the next 10 years. So aspirations, we ask about what would you like to achieve in the next 10 years? Expectations, we ask about what do you think will happen? And then we also do a Mansky type subjective elicitation of subjective expectations. If I get there, I'll show you. We find on average expectations are slightly lower than aspirations, and the patterns in treatment effects that we see are very similar. So we do think people differentiate between those two concepts in their minds, but the results are broadly consistent across them. So it seems like people's goals move in line with their expectation or their reported expectations for what will actually happen across those different measures.
Kate, I had a related question, which is just that it seems that if you ask somebody about aspirations, I don't know if this is true, but would it be true that whatever they say on that question might be correlated with other kinds of things, whether it's self-efficacy or, you know, locus of control, or I don't even affect or depression? Like, I guess, is it the case that these things really tend to correlate between people? And so you're measuring this and you're calling it that, but do we really know if that is the operable thing?
So we did measure self-efficacy, locus of control, and depression. We don't see a strong correlation between aspirations or locus of control. Between aspirations and self-efficacy or locus of control. We do see correlations between self-efficacy and locus of control, as you would expect, but it doesn't seem like aspirations is a similar concept. We also don't find treatment effects in the long term on self-efficacy and locus of control. So we don't think it is that. There is a bit of a stronger relationship between aspirations and depression, but the psychological intervention, as one might expect, isn't affecting levels of depression. We measured that as well. So we can't completely rule out that the concepts are somewhat related, but in our sample, certainly they don't seem to be. It does seem to be through this channel.
Okay, thank you.
So the transfer program I've already spoken about. So now to talk a bit about the psychological intervention, and I'll do a bit on this because I know there are a number of psychologists in the audience. So this comes from, or this sort of theory backing, to the extent that we have a good psychological understanding, comes a lot from social learning theory. So that suggests that, you know, when people are developing their sense of goals and what they want to aim for the future, they look at other people who quite like them. And they learn from their experiences, and they use those to kind of calibrate what is possible for them. And so that's the sort of general idea of how people will set these goals. So we use a role model intervention. We collected a lot of stories about people from similar communities who had succeeded. And then with a media company, we scripted together 2 documentaries about 2 female role models who had visualized their future, they'd set goals, and they'd overcome challenges to end up improving their economic position. There's also been a lot of economic work more broadly on how exposure to role models can change people's behavior, not so much economically, but in relation to fertility and divorce. So there's been quite a lot of work suggesting that being exposed to a role model is quite a powerful challenge for behavior change. We also, and I think Catherine Thomas is in the audience, she's a psychology student at Stanford who did a lot of work helping us access this literature. So the characters in the videos are also shown applying common psychological tools, which have been found to improve effort and success in rich countries in the educational psychology literature. So some examples are the participants in the video imagine how they want their life to look in 5 years' time if it has gone as well as it possibly could. That's called a best possible selves intervention in psychology. So someone does that in the video, and then in the exercises that we do with participants after they watch the video, they also do that exercise themselves. The other two parts of the exercise are that people identify and prioritize long-term goals, and then they break them into smaller steps. They also anticipate and plan for obstacles that they might face and are encouraged to see them as learning opportunities. And so there's been some evidence, as I said, that these affect study time and test scores among children, but they haven't been used in a lot of settings among adults. So this is a bundled intervention, both of an exposure, kind of inspirational exposure to a role model, and then exercises to apply some of the lessons that one's learned from the role model in one's own life. So this is just some pictures. This is Judy and Oyo. They're talking about their goal to put a tin roof on their house. They're making a plan for what they would like to try and do in 1 year. So it's not to get to the tin roof. They just want to be able to own their own plot. And then they anticipate some obstacles that might happen to the income generating activities they want to do. Eventually they succeed and they manage to open a tailoring business, and then they manage to send one of their children off to secondary education. So the placebo video, we made the real videos, and then we took all of the stills in the video that might have given any new information to participants who watched them. And then we bundled those together into a placebo video with a voiceover. So it says, great insights like people can grow crops like maize, vegetables like tomatoes, and fruits like bananas in this community, or people can raise chickens. So this is to try and make sure that the information content across the two groups is as similar as possible. And then people also do an exercise afterwards where they discuss the content of the video that is similar in length and in format to what happens in the active video. So people also get this experience of interacting with facilitators from outside the community.
Kate, there's one question from Frank.
Hi, Kate. So great to see you. I wanted to ask whether people's expectations and their aspirations are realistic in some way that you can measure, or whether there are certain domains or areas where people are perhaps particularly underconfident in some ways, where you might say, well, interventions might be particularly expected to be fruitful.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think one that we would like to explore in a lot more depth. Unfortunately, we didn't ask them about, what would you like to have done in a year? That would have been a good thing to do. I think we've looked at their current reports of where they say they are on income and assets, and those are pretty realistic. And I think the people's aspirations, if you use the subjective expectations distributions, they're in about the 90th percentile of the expectations distribution. So they are high, but they aren't higher than what people report as being their expectations on a standard type question. I think one thing we could do, which we haven't done, is actually look at, for the people who've done the best in improving their income over the period we see them, how do people's aspirations compare to that? So we could look at that. But broadly, they seem to be surprisingly realistic for what we thought.
Thank you.
Is about 25 minutes to wrap up so we can have 10 minutes for discussion feasible? Yeah.
Yes, I think that should be okay.
Okay. And if you're running out of time, we'll limit to clarifying questions, but for now, let's keep going as is.
Yeah. So we're going to look at 6 pre-specified families of outcomes. So we did this in a pre-analysis plan. Labor supply and expenditure on inputs, as well as spending on education, are the sort of primary future-oriented behaviors that we think about. And then revenue, asset stocks, and consumption are a little bit more like end outcomes. So they are partly a result of your behavior, but they may also be affected by other things. So very quickly to go through this bit, if one was trying to fit this into a standard economic framework, so we haven't done any new sort of theory work here. We draw on initial work that has been done on aspirations and trying to include them into economic models. And the very basic idea is that you assume a normal utility function. So people get utility from consumption and leisure. They choose consumption versus investment, or leisure versus effort. But in addition, you assume that they set a reference point, so a goal. And that if they, so in the previous period, they would have set a goal for this current period now. If they manage to meet that goal or exceeded it, then they get a utility boost. If they fail to meet that goal, then they get a utility penalty. So they experience some loss. So this gives us predictions for what each of the interventions will do. So broadly, if people have an increase in their aspirations for the future, that means that they're going to want to meet those aspirations in the future. So right now, they're going to shift away from consumption and leisure towards investment and labor supply. And that will eventually lead to them having higher assets that they can use to finance the higher consumption aspirations that they've formed. In terms of the cash intervention, we're not going to focus so much on what an aspirations model does here, because we can't really test it. It's not possible to give a cash intervention and make sure that it doesn't affect people's aspirations. So we're just going to stick to, a cash transfer higher assets would probably lead to higher consumption and investment. We're not sure what it would do to labor supply. But importantly, the cash intervention might also raise aspirations, and this would have a similar effect to what the psych intervention would do. And then finally, if you add, for predictions about adding cash to psych, this really depends on how you set up the model. And in particular, it depends on how you think aspirations are formed. So, are they a function of wealth? Are they a function of other things in addition? But potentially, under many sensible ways of putting the model together, you would imagine a shift from current consumption and leisure towards investment. So the first main step I was going to take was to look at whether aspirations are in fact a barrier to future-oriented investment, but at low levels of wealth. So this is among the two groups of women who don't get a cash transfer. So the aspirations question was just, what would you like your household to reach at the end of the next 10 years? So we measured this in 3 different domains. We see positive but not significant effects on people's income and asset aspirations. And we see a very strong effect on their aspirations for their children's education. So that ends up being of about 0.2 of a year. And they're wanting children to get just under a university level of education. And so if you put them into an index, as we specified, you get this positive effect on people's aspirations. We then look at what happens from this same intervention to behavior, and we see some fairly sizable effects on some of the future-oriented investments that we had pre-specified. So we'll note that across all of these, you will see they're not always strongly significant, and so they don't survive the multiple testing correction that we had specified. But the ones, in the ones where we were particularly interested, where we thought that those were behaviors rather than later stage end outcomes, we do see some quite strong effects. So we see about a 5% increase in labor supply, a large increase in inputs, so about 22%, and then some increases in these downstream outcomes. So revenue, non-land assets, and in household consumption. We also do some exploratory analysis to understand what people are doing. So the increased labor supply is mainly the respondent rather than their spouse. She has the most control over her behavior. What they're doing, so people are putting more land under cultivation, adopting some new technologies, and then spending some more on inputs. This is happening mainly in non-farm enterprises, so fishing, services, retail. And having looked at value added across people's different uses, or, so agriculture, livestock, or non-farm enterprise, this seems potentially to be a slightly more profitable type of activity, although there's obviously selection into who does what. And then in terms of increased assets, we see quite strong evidence of increased savings behavior, so increased savings balances, but people also report more Roska memberships, contributing more to Roskas. And when they're buying assets, it's mainly small livestock and enterprise assets. They're obviously still facing credit constraints if those exist, but we do see people saving and investing in that way. We don't see that this is overall making people more productive, but we do see that the people who potentially had more capital to begin with, so those who had existing non-farm businesses, those people do increase their profits. And then finally, we looked, as I said, at other mechanisms. So we don't, the placebo design, we hope already shuts down some of the information channel. We also looked at whether households mimicked the very particular behaviors in the video, and they don't report doing that. We measured people's beliefs about the returns, the potential returns to effort, or how possible it was for them to overcome obstacles. As I said, we didn't see effects on self-efficacy, growth mindset. I should have locus of control there as well. We measured that as well. And then also no effects on various beliefs about the return to effort or new technology or to investing in education. No effects on preferences. And then we do some tests. We think we can rule out social desirability bias as a mechanism. So the second part of the question then is, we've seen that aspirations are a barrier to future-oriented investment when people are poor. So what happens when people's wealth increases? Does that relationship persist? So I'm going to go through the different parts of this table, but as we've already said, this additional intervention to boost aspirations doesn't really have an additional effect on people's economic outcomes when they've already got cash in most domains, except for in education. So just to go through the table a bit more slowly. So this is the psych treatment effects that I already showed you earlier. These are the effects of just receiving the cash. So these line up pretty nicely with other studies that have been done, particularly in this area. So we see a positive effect on labor supply, a big increase in whether people are spending on their economic activities and on their revenue, and then an increase in non-land assets and in consumption. A secondary outcome was also housing, which, as we know from the other Give Directly work, people spend a lot on improving their houses, and we see similar results. The big thing that's also, we were surprised by, but is common across other cash transfer programs, is that there isn't a big increase in spending on education. And indeed, we see that if you look at the combined group, so the group who get both the video intervention and the cash transfer, they're very similar. So we can't reject that they're the same as their outcomes are the same as the cash group, except for in education, where we see this very substantial increase. So they're spending almost 3 times as much on their children's education. When we look at this is driven, there's no difference in spending for boys and girls. It's mainly driven by the older age group of children, so those aged 14 to 20, and it's mainly driven by school fees. We unfortunately didn't measure if it's about switching into private schools, but we suspect that may be what it is. We don't see effects on the enrollment margin. So it's all about how people are spending, but that may be because of fairly high rates of enrollment in that group to begin with.
Okay. There was a clarifying question from Bilal Siddiqui.
Hi, I'm so sorry if I've missed this, but how were the participants in the exercise and the video selected from within each household? Were the specific members, was it random, or was it all household members? Because I feel like there's a lot of intra-household dynamics that...
Yes, that's a good point. So sorry, I should have said that. So the person who does the survey, so we selected the primary woman to do the survey. She also receives the video intervention. The household can decide who receives the cash. But in 88% of households, I think, the household decides on this woman to receive the cash, largely because the woman is home during the day when the Give Directly agent arrives, and she's not going to say no to receiving the cash. So we think that, but we knew that pattern occurred, which was why we focused strongly on the woman. And then we do also have some other work looking at the intra-household dynamics, which I won't go into now. But this there are obviously interesting questions about if this had been targeted at men who are traditionally the head of the household, might it have had different effects on the household's economic outcomes? Yeah, so we aren't able to speak to those questions, but I think that's definitely a really interesting issue.
Kate, one other question about where your effects are targeted there. I mean, the intervention was really not about intergenerational transmission, right? It wasn't about your aspirations for your kids. It was about your aspirations for you and, you know, like I can get a sewing machine. And so is it a bit surprising that that's where things ended up being loaded? Like,
so I should have put those pictures in as well. The sort of end of one of the stories is that they managed to send their son off to secondary school. And that was something that they draw in their little goal setting picture at the beginning. So there is an element of education being represented as a sort of positive investment that you can aim for in the future. But definitely it is primarily about the woman and her own experience and the immediate economic aspirations. So I think, yeah, we could look at how much time we spend on each, but there is an education part to the story. So, you know, just to, in this final bit, to go through why we think we see this pattern of effects. So if you remember with the conceptual framework, we suggested that a psychological intervention would affect economic outcomes by changing people's reference point, which we measured with aspirations. We then thought, well, cash would have the standard effects that cash does. It might also affect people's reference point. And then we thought that the combined and the cash interventions would have different effects on economic outcomes if they have different effects on the reference point. So, you know, by and large, people in those interventions are getting cash. That's the main thing that's happening. The one difference is that the combined group also have this intervention that might shift their reference point. And so, you know, that would be where the differences would arise if they did. And so that suggests we should look at the difference between cash and combined effects on aspirations. And so indeed, what we see lines up with the effects on behavioral outcomes. So the cash group don't increase their education and aspirations. So you can see those here, but the combined group do, although we can't reject that they are statistically significantly different. And then here we see the effect, you know, the big difference in education spending. In contrast, if you look at people's asset aspirations and their income aspirations, those are very similar between the cash and the combined group, so both for assets and for income. And indeed, we see that people, you know, what actually happens. So this is after 10 years, but then what actually happens after nearly 2 years, we also see similar effects on assets and on income between the cash and the combined groups. And so that leads us to suggest that where the reference point differs between the cash and the combined group, we see differences in behavior and outcomes. But where the reference point is changed in the same way, we see similar outcomes. So if I've got, I think I've got about another 5 minutes. Is that okay, Supreet?
Yeah, more than.
So these results then, sort of taking it back to the theoretical framework, have some implications for models of aspirations formation. And that's where we're sort of working on the paper now. So the models that I spoke about always take the aspiration or the reference point as exogenous. It just kind of drops from outside. And there's suggestions about how people form these aspirations, but they haven't been looked at so much in models of aspirations. So our results, you know, as you will have seen, really suggest that the aspirations may be, for different sort of domains, may be formed in quite different ways. So it really seems like your economic aspirations depend on your economic position. So we see a number of patterns consistent with this. At baseline, economic aspirations increase with wealth. The cash intervention increases the aspirations, but we also see, which I haven't shown here, but we see that the psych intervention effects on economic aspirations decrease with wealth. So the effects are smaller for households that are wealthier at baseline. And when you get really wealthy, the psych intervention has no additional effect on your economic aspirations compared to cash. In contrast, we see that there are some aspirations, sort of barriers or constraints in education, which seem to remain despite people's wealth constraints. And so what we're trying to understand now is what is it about these education aspirations that's different from the economic aspirations and that makes them less malleable to just a shock in income. And interestingly, in the work that we did in Ethiopia, where we did a similar video, but in a very different, much more rural context, we saw the same effect largely on education aspirations, and then also on education spending. So it does seem to be that this domain is sensitive to the video intervention, but what we find in this experiment is not just to a change in wealth. So just to conclude, we find that low aspirations are a barrier to investment at low levels of wealth. And then when there's a large increase, this barrier disappears in some, but not all domains of aspirations. And so if we go back to the policy implications that we were talking about at the beginning, this has different implications depending on what your goal is as a policymaker. So if you're really just interested in immediate poverty alleviation, it seems that the message from our intervention is, if you're doing a big enough wealth transfer, don't worry about the aspiration stuff. That's going to take care of itself. On the other hand, if your policy goal is really long-term intergenerational investments, then these additional behavioral interventions might have quite high returns. So we just did the cost calculations, and it cost about $130 PPP additional cost to add the psych onto the cash intervention. And that paid, in terms of what families were putting into education of the cash transfer that they got, it was roughly that same amount. So it seems like a pretty cost-effective intervention if education is your goal. Then in terms of implications for future research, the one is clearly that this multidimensional nature of aspirations is important, but then the other is that it's really important to start to think about where these aspirations come from, as well as their impact on behavior.
Great. Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful.